Hello and welcome back to Looking Forward, a weekly podcast of debate and discussion about politics and ideas. Today we're looking back as well as looking forward. We're looking back 10 years to when the Liberal Party dumped Malcolm Turnbull as leader for the first time. Our forward outlook is on the economy, as the airwaves are full of talk of stimulus, be it fiscal or monetary or whatever. We'll question that. And the first issue, though, we're going to look at is the Morrison government's laws to tackle rogue unions, which got sunk in Parliament this week by Pauline Hanson, amongst others. Why did she do that, and were the laws worth fighting for? In our regular Books and Culture segment, we honour a key work of the late Clive James, discuss a new book about the history of music, another with the wonderful title Against the Left, and a book you'll only hear about on this podcast, a self-help book from Roger Ailes, the founder of Fox News. Thank you, Gideon, for that one. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. To learn more about our work and all the epic research undertaken by all the very smart people we have here, please go to ipa.org.au. I'm Scott Hargraves, editor of the IPA Review, which, of course, all members get in the mail 4 times a year if you join. But it is time now to introduce the other panellists. First of all, my co-host from RMIT University, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
Thanks as always. On my left is Kurt Wallace, Research Fellow at the IPA.
Good morning.
Great to have you back. And, of course, our esteemed Director of Policy, Gideon Rosner.
G'day, Scott.
Yes, the golden tonsils of Gideon Rosner back on the podcast table.
I have to come on the show more often.
He doesn't need more buttering up.
Yes, I do. Lay it on me.
As I mentioned, we're going to start with a topical issue, which is what happened in Parliament with the government's Ensuring Integrity Bill, Chris.
That's right, Scott. So the government was apparently somewhat surprised last week when its union bill, the Ensuring Integrity Bill, or more formally the Fair Work Registered Organisations Amendment, Ensuring Integrity Bill in 2019, was defeated in the Senate when the government failed to secure the One Nation support that they thought they were going to get. There's a few things to talk about here, including how One Nation thinks about the union movement, but to talk about the bill initially. So the bill has been weaving its way through Parliament for actually a couple of years now, but the intention of the bill is to allow courts to disqualify unions and union officials from serving in a, quote, registered organisation, a union or a employer group. This is partly in response to the Royal Commission into Trade Unions recommendation. One of the interesting things about this bill is that it would allow any person who has, quote, sufficient interest in union governance to apply to the court for to disqualify a union or a union official. You will be disqualified, or the court will rule you are disqualified if they determine that you've done things like violate the Fair Work Act and so forth. I might initially throw to you, Gideon, on the bill itself. I mean, what's your was this good policy? Is this a loss for freedom as you see it, or
It's not terrible policy, which is sadly more than you can say for a lot of what this coalition government does and what the Liberal Party does these days. But I'm not crying into my beer over the fact that it was lost. I mean, yes, union thuggery is a problem, but frankly, the Liberal Party and the coalition has been banging on about union thuggery for 10 years. For one thing, it's a silly thing to do, or it's a pointless thing to do politically, because it doesn't really seem to shift any votes. Every time the Liberal Party runs on union thuggery, whether it be 2007 with the scare campaign that was ran, whether it be the Daniel Andrews election in 2014 about John Setka, people don't like it, but they don't. It doesn't, affect any votes. But on a public policy level, the problem with the unions isn't their bad behaviour, at least not entirely. The problem with industrial relations in this country, that it is extremely over-regulated, that we have among the highest minimum wages in the developed world, or the highest minimum wage in the world. We have an extremely complicated process of setting minimum wages across industries via industrial awards, via enterprise bargaining agreements, which are now so complicated as to become useless. So the bottom line is nothing about this bill would have done anything about the fact that we have a combined youth unemployment and underemployment rate of 30%. Nothing about this bill would have prevented the done anything about the fact that small business owners are being dragged to the great kangaroo court that is the Fair Work Commission and hit with $10,000, $20,000 fees for staff that they've hired for one day under unfair dismissal laws. Nothing would have prevented the huge amount of paperwork that comes with giving people a job in this country. I'm
sympathetic to that argument, but there are genuine issues there, and in terms of say the construction industry, of course, is most famously the industry where the rule of law doesn't run. I think there's something playing out here, which is I'm not sure this bill would have actually achieved what the government hoped it would, because really what's changed in the rules of the game is the tremendous power that individual unions have accrued in this system. I was reflecting this morning that we are in the world that Bill Kelty and Bob Hawke envisaged 40 years ago, when the union movement was fragmented, and individual unions could be picked off, if you like. They could be deregistered. The union leaders, as late as the late 60s, could be jailed for breaches of industrial law until that was eventually overturned. And they said, we're going to have big unions that are going to be so wealthy, so powerful that they won't be able to be touched. And that is actually the world we live in.
Yep.
This targeting of union officials is, to me, something that they've reached for in the kit bag, because essentially they've now got so much money that the financial penalties that the federal court has been imposing on unions for the numerous breaches of the law are simply not affecting behaviour. So they've reached in there and they've taken the lead from the Royal Commission and said, well, they should be governed like corporations, and we'll target the officers of the union. So I'm not sure it's ideal.
We might throw to Kurt. So, Kurt, as Scott says, one of the big arguments that the government has been making over the last couple of years is, well, let's govern unions like corporations. Corporations, you can be deregistered as a company officer. You, the court have all these tools. Why don't and on one side, but why don't we apply the same on the other side in the industrial relations bargain? Do you buy that argument? Are unions and corporations, should they be equivalently regulated?
Well, I think there's some key differences between corporations and unions, but ultimately I think that the members should be the ones who are deciding who officiates the union. And I don't think that moves, even if it's a move to make it consistent with corporations, is a move in the right direction. I think that there are structural problems with how unions operate based on a lot of legal protections they have in the law in the first place that gives an incentive for them to behave the way that they are. And just replacing the people in those positions as officials, I don't think will solve the underlying problems.
No, this is what I was incredibly struck by doing the reading up on this bill. I mean, these unions are regulated by something called the Registered Organisations Commission, which is only a couple of years old. And when we complain about impenetrable bureaucracies, incredible control over social institutions. In fact, we're talking about organisations precisely the same as the Registered Organisations Commission. It is a parody of the regulatory state controlling the union movement. And I'm carrying no water for the union movement by any means, but fundamentally, to Kurt's point, if we think that unions are at their best, social organisations of people coming together to collectively bargain on their own terms in a market environment, then why are we trying to regulate them in this way?
I think, Chris, you're talking about unions as they should be rather than as they are in a regulatory sense.
Absolutely.
In Australia. Now, there is nothing wrong with workers freely deciding to associate and collectively bargain. In a perfect world, that would be the system that we have. However, the Fair Work Act is the latest incarnation of the great Australian tradition, basically going back to federation, of giving unions a privileged legal position in Australia. They are consulted in relation to the 122 so-called modern awards that, in effect, create a cascading system of minimum wages. They are the default bargaining agent by law in EBA negotiations, which is basically the only way to have an alternative to those awards. They have rivers of gold coming from compulsory superannuation and the industry super funds that have sprang up around that. So I get that they have to be curtailed in some way, but the best way to do that would be to remove the privileges that our law gives them. Well, what they're trying to do is solve the problem of bad regulation, a bad regulatory apparatus with another bad regulatory apparatus.
That's absolutely right. And this is how we get the regulatory state. And looking through, so for instance, the incredible, so there's such thing as protected and unprotected legal, industrial action. So, there's a protected strike. And if you go on a protected strike or do other protected industrial action, you won't be fired. If you do unprotected, then you can be fired. Now, the idea of protected industrial action is precisely what you're talking about.
Correct.
It is a privilege, and by law it protects you from being sacked or being otherwise penalised. But because we've built that structure, we've built this incredible governance framework, legal governance framework around when something should be considered protected industrial action, which involves you as in a union movement. I'm talking to you, Gideon. Sure,
I'd be a great union leader.
You'd be wonderful. Which involves Gideon going to the government for permission
to strike,
which I just think is comically bad. And fundamentally in opposition to the very idea of industrial action, I would have thought. But,
defeats the purpose, doesn't it?
Again, Gideon's the unionist, not me. But it's also just a parody of the over-regulated nature of our industrial relations system.
Only Australia could construct a system like that.
It's
only in Australia.
So which brings...
And so we're all very proud.
Which brings us back to the politics of this. I mean, I must admit I wasn't following it closely enough to have picked this, but in retrospect, which is always the best way to talk about politics.
Yeah, it's the safest way.
I would have picked it if I'd been paying attention. Why are we surprised that One Nation in the end did not endorse this? I mean, the phenomenon of the federal election just gone was what the politics that we saw in Queensland, the revolt of the blue collar vote. We've got a populist right party. Populist right parties do not object to unions. They have no fundamental issue with unions. There are blue collar voters who get around it. We saw a One Nation candidate in the seat of Hunter in the coal mining district outside Newcastle, had a 20% swing towards One Nation, basically a coal miner. Central Queensland, it's clear now that the unions played a very subtle game with Pauline Hanson and One Nation, but they were probably pushing through an open door. That it wasn't like the leadership who flew up from Sydney or Melbourne. It was miners from Central Queensland who went to talk to Pauline Hanson and Malcolm Roberts.
Yeah, and I think the government was thrown because they were hearing different things from Malcolm Roberts, who's more of a pro-business One Nation member than Pauline Hanson, who they were hearing other things, but it appears that Pauline Hanson made the decision. But I've got this quote from, precisely as you talk about, a Queensland union leader talking about Pauline Hanson's attitude in The Guardian. He said, she still has reservations about unions, but she recognises the majority do a good job the majority of the time, and they're coming to realise that the word union isn't that bad. I think part of the populist revolution that we've seen in states like Queensland, and particularly in certain seats, is hardly a free market revolution, but it's a bringing it back to the land, bringing it back to the people type revolution.
I think it just highlights the point I made earlier that unions are not as deeply unpopular as the coalition seems to think they are. There are certain elements of what unions do that people don't like, but I think on a net basis, people have this idea in their head. It's a bit like these straw polls about the ABC. Not the ratings are relatively low compared to the commercials, but when you ask people, do you trust the ABC as an important, the results tend
or do you like the ABC?
Yeah,
to which I've always thought, like, when you ask people whether they like television, they're going to say yes, they like television.
Well, correct. Do you like, people see unions, at least in theory, as a positive force. So this is why picking on them for a bit of bad behaviour is a net loss, because at the end of the day, people, rightly or wrongly, feel happy that these institutions exist.
And Kurt, it doesn't have arguing about the unions doesn't give you a vision of a better world. It's not about like if we crack down on the unions, then suddenly we'll be more prosperous. Correct. Or there'll be more employment.
Yeah, well, this bill is hardly a big picture bill. It's really distracting, I think, from drastically needed overhaul of the industrial relations system and a bigger picture of how that would actually help benefit the labour force and improve those figures that Gideon was outlining before. But I think, this is I see the purpose of a bill like this in terms of trying to hold unions to account for breaking the law, but in the big picture thing is really missing from this, and I think that it's not really something that the coalition can create a narrative around about how they're improving the economy through their IR reform. So I think that's what remains to be done by the coalition government under Morrison.
Words to live by.
Yes, indeed. And we are going to come back to what does an actual reform agenda, but someone who was very focused on a big picture, unfortunately it was the wrong big picture, was Malcolm Turnbull. 10 years ago, he was very focused on a conference that was coming up in Copenhagen, which was going to decide the future of the world's climate and stop the sea levels rising and save the glaciers and do all sorts of other things. This had some political repercussions.
It had some political repercussions. That's right. So, Twitter and the press has been all aghast about it's the 10-year anniversary of the December 2009 leadership spill, where Tony Abbott defeated Malcolm Turnbull by one vote in a spill for the Liberal opposition leadership, 42 to 41. Joe Hockey, if you remember, historians amongst us might remember that Joe Hockey was also a contender in that ballot, but didn't make it through the second round. The issue, of course, as you say, was whether the opposition should support the Rudd government's emissions trading scheme, which they were going to try to amend, but the Nationals and many backbenchers in the Liberal Party were deeply opposed. Once this spill occurred, it really locked in, and I'll talk to Gideon in a moment about this, but it really locked the coalition in behind opposition to the carbon tax, to emissions trading schemes more generally. The moment Abbott became leader, the Liberal Party voted against the ETS very convincingly 2 days later. I say it locked in, which it was very much up for grabs for a long time. And it wasn't, it's not just that Malcolm Turnbull only won by one vote. It's also John Howard had announced an emissions trading scheme in the 2007 election. Gideon, you had a piece in The Spectator, which is really the piece you were born to write, I feel. We hope you got it out of your system, but you wrote a piece in The We'll find out in a sec.
I want to be a historian about that very, very one event.
All right, so yes.
And about the Turnbull government.
Exactly. You're a historian who specialises in a single day. Yeah. Gideon wrote a piece in The Spectator called "Haunted by the Miserable Ghost." What's the vibe of that
well, firstly, I didn't choose the title, although it's a very apt one. But look, it's something I wanted to write because it's a political event that is actually very underrated in its significance. And that was the day on 2009, as you said, in which Tony Abbott defeated Malcolm Turnbull by a single vote over the issue of emissions trading. Now, before that, it's easy to forget. Before that point, it was almost unthinkable that the coalition would not have some sort of emissions policy, but more than that, not just an emissions policy, but a carbon trading policy of some kind. I mean, that was the Overton window at the time. And I remember, at the time I was a kid, I was at university, I was working in a politician's office part-time, and the number of emails and letters that were received by ordinary grassroots, salt-of-the-earth people saying this is a terrible, terrible idea was absolutely overwhelming. And I think Tony Abbott saw that, and I think he saw the deep difficulty with what the emissions trading scheme would have done economically, what it would have done to the very fabric of our country. And, the lefties on Twitter are mourning it as the start of the climate wars, but it really was the start of that product differentiation. And as soon as Tony Abbott said all it took to reverse the whole conversation about, carbon emissions and carbon trading and carbon farming and carbon accounting and all this useless stream of detail that was the climate debate, accepting emissions trading as a fait accompli in itself, all it took to knock that over was a very simple message, that Kevin Rudd's ETS was nothing more and nothing less than a great big new tax on everything. And the Liberal Party, importantly, got an enormous bounce out of that. The polling recovered almost overnight. Kevin Rudd, at the time, was the most popular Prime Minister the country had ever known, at least on paper. Within 6 months, he was gone. Julia Gillard was demolished 6 months after that. And then 3 years later, Tony Abbott finished off the job in an emphatic victory, all because people reject green carbon trading and green hysteria and everything else. In fact, they've rejected every economic opportunity in the final electoral opportunity. And the final point I would make is that it was the first defeat of Turnbullism. Turnbullism being Chamber of Commerce economic liberalism wrapped up in green chicanery and innovation claptrap. And this is what really annoys me. Final point. Sorry, you got me going now. This will be the first 3 hour looking forward podcast. The final point,
this is the third final point. But
it exposes the utter vacuousness of this false dichotomy between Turnbull, small liberals and conservatives. There is nothing about what Turnbull ever put forward that in any way would have satisfied genuine economic liberals. And there is nothing socially conservative about opposing an emissions trading scheme.
Kurt, do you share Gideon's passion, if nothing else?
Yeah, I think
it's half a white Valium after that.
I think he's spot on, and I think the tragedy is that the Liberal Party went back to Turnbull and didn't learn the lessons from that incident. And I think at the time, as you rightly bring up, the establishment was very much, the Overton window was not allowing for any movement on that. And I think that at the time, the pressure to implement more climate change policies was really increasing at an alarming rate, and I think it was really abated by globally by the GFC, which I think sort of took that agenda back a little bit. But I think that the important lesson here is that there is a wide electorate desire for to stop these infringements and these big new taxes. And I think that the Liberal Party, unfortunately, hasn't really learned the lessons from their electoral success in 2013 and need to really get back to that. A positive move, obviously, with Morrison taking over from Turnbull, but again, we haven't really seen any unwinding of all of the subsidies and like the renewable subsidies.
No, but by design, because the moment Tony Abbott became leader, he had to buy off, or he thought he had to buy off, many of the pro-Turnbull people, which is why he announced direct action. And direct action there's a lot to say about direct action. If we all think back to then, what we have now is sort of the air of direct action, really. But the direct action was this incredibly complex regulatory subsidisation system that was meant to do precisely what the carbon tax did. And so I share Gideon's analysis of the politics there, but policy by policy, the change was not so dramatic.
I don't think you can compare.
No. Some of that's happened later. It's been snuck back in later.
Red
might have opened the door.
The red is a long-term.
The red is a John Howard creation.
Red is a long-standing policy, but the
direct action. I don't think I love it. I don't think it's particularly necessary. But that was basically planting a few trees and paying a few polluters not to pollute. It's far different from forcing companies to report their emissions, to buy credits.
They still have to.
That
wasn't repealed.
Again, not as a result of an Abbott policy, but an existing one, but to have to buy credits for their emissions, to have to audit their emissions, to have to engage in these extremely complex trading systems to offset them.
No, but here we go again. You see, this is exactly what you identified in your piece, and it really is a ripper, and it'll be in the show notes. It reminded me of... this is high praise indeed. It reminded me of Road to Serfdom.
Oh, wow.
Because what you were pointing out is that this is what happens, and this is how experts and elites take over the attention of government. Because when we were going off to Copenhagen, supposedly with promises to implement this emissions trading scheme, There was going to be a bipartisan policy. All the focus is then on the implementation. And it gets more and more technical and more detailed. And I was actually working in this field at the time, and even Tim Wilson, who was at the IPA at the time, I think, didn't he go off and do like a master's in carbon accounting?
Yeah.
like you talk about, you wonder why the economy is going downhill when all the resources that could actually go into wealth creation are instead going into learning about the finer points of carbon accounting. And that's where it was. Like, is it better to plant trees, or are we going to have to tax cows for the methane? Or, it's all, and all this bitty stuff. I nearly got a job as someone whose job was to report on carbon emissions. I'd be...
To be a fly on the wall for that.
I'd be out of my mind on OxyContin by now. It's the only way I would have got through the day. But you reminded me that was the slippery slope.
Yeah.
And all at once, Abbott pulled back, and suddenly all those people go away. No one cares about them anymore. I don't care that you're an expert in carbon accounting.
Yeah.
Just for God's sake, get out of our road while we actually build some wealth. So I think that's the real lesson that I take out of it.
I'm desperately trying to pull up a story that one of my favourite memories of Tim actually working at the IPA. He went to Copenhagen, the Copenhagen conference, and when he was there, he found the list of delegates from the different countries, and Australia had sent by far the most, not just relative to population size, but something like 150 Australian public servants.
Rudd's hairdresser.
I'm desperately trying to find it, so if I do find it, we'll put it up in the show notes.
That was the craziness of the time. Again, to make the point, the 2000s were really, this craziness of, it was almost like the Y2K debate, but there were law firms, Australian law firms sending people to Copenhagen for no good reason, just because they wanted a piece of this action. It was a very, very sub-rational zeitgeist.
Well, they were focused on the bottom line. They would have done very well out of it.
They certainly would have. Yeah,
but we can talk about the importance of 2009. But the carbon tax was passed. I mean, we did get a carbon tax in 2011, and so one of the things that on the left you often hear that you can't do reform anymore. And the iconic model is the carbon tax. We needed to do major structural reform to our economy, but look what happened. Tony Abbott rolled Malcolm Turnbull, and I've always thought that was bizarre because yes, 2 years later you got precisely the structural reform you're so desperate for. So and yes, it was repealed, but in a funny way it shows that we still have some sort of dynamic public policy system that you can have two sides of politics fundamentally disagree about a policy and implement their preferred positions.
If only they'd use those powers for good.
Yeah.
That'll never happen.
Well, what the Abbott ascendancy, though, did was make it, well, firstly, to offer the choice. Now, Tony Abbott did repeal the carbon tax, and it was, one of the first things he did. I don't think even a Tony Abbott would have been able to repeal a bipartisan emissions trading scheme that had been in for longer than that. Once the policy is in for a while, it's difficult
that's the path to mandatory. I've now been retailing the UK, of course. I mean, they have a bipartisan now that the entire economy is going to have net zero emissions by 2050. Yeah. I mean, this is insane. And when they're shut down, or when nuclear is on the nose, and all, there's I think they're allowed to build one hugely expensive reactor, and that's about it. But the Conservatives have locked in behind it. Yeah. So there's bipartisan, insane emissions policies.
It becomes a sacred cow you can't slaughter, and that's what it would have done if it had passed. And Rudd would have won the subsequent election as well, and had another term to bed it down. It was a game changer.
So let's get back to the things that actually are important, unlike carbon accounting, which is the future of the Australian economy. There are some worrying signs, some flatness out there, but most of the coverage that's coming out of Canberra and the national media is around, does this mean we need stimulus? And the arguments around, is it fiscal or monetary stimulus?
Yeah, look, and Scott, on the face of it, there's some pretty concerning signs just from the RBA. So right now, as many listeners will know, the official cash rate is at 0.75%, which is significantly lower than it ever was during the GFC. The RBA, for the last multiple years, has consistently or nearly consistently failed to hit its inflation target. The RBA has an inflation target of 2 to 3%. percent per year. It has hit that in precisely two of the last 12 quarters, I think. So you know, on the face of it, this is pretty bad. We have a RBA that's designed to hit a inflation target. We have incredibly low cash rates, and everybody's failing to do their job. But Kurt, you've been looking into this quite deeply. Is this a problem? Should we be concerned? Should we be thinking about fiscal policy changes, monetary policy changes? How do you think through these issues?
Well, I think there's a lot going on here. So the last 7 years, the cash rate has been at record or equal to record lows. That can be that's easy monetary policy. That's stimulating monetary policy that we've had for the last 7 years, and that's what has led to our current predicament. And now we have calls for more easy monetary policy through quantitative easing, and even suggestions that we should implement negative interest rates.
What is a negative interest rate, by the way?
So a negative interest rate would be...
Just bear with us while we do a little bit of an economics tutorial.
Yeah, I probably should have looked this up before I came home on. I probably should know this to begin with.
Josh to do a little animation, and we'll add it to the YouTube video.
So fundamentally, it would be reversing the relationship between creditor and debtor, in that you'd actually be paid to take a loan. That's if it flowed through.
Yeah, that's what I thought it was.
A negative interest rate, the banks store money with the RBA, and usually they pay an interest rate on that. What if instead they tax them? And so, of course, the banks are then going to want to spend their reserves. So the idea is the banks are going to want to pour out their money into the economy. So, you know, and one of the interesting things that's going on right now is that this works well if all your money is controlled by the government. So if all the money is digital, it works very poorly if you can take cash and put it under your bed. So this is one of the reasons they want to crack down on cash.
It's a funny coincidence that we have pushes by the government to outlaw transactions above $10,000 while we have
probably
negative
nothing
interest
to do
rates.
with it. Negative interest rates are one of them, and Philip Lowe, as the RBA chief, has been a little bit dismissive about that, but he's been a bit more open to quantitative easing.
Yeah, so he's outlined just recently about quantitative easing that it would be a consideration once they've lowered to 0.25%. So at the current rate, that's just 2 further cuts, which is widely predicted.
By the end of next year.
It's widely predicted by the end of next year. So if we have those 2 extra cuts and there's no inflation that's jumping into that 2 to 3% target, then the logical next step is for the RBA to engage in further ramping up of their easy monetary policy through quantitative easing. So this then brings back to the question of the legitimacy of that inflation target. Because if we maintain that inflation target...
Because we need to keep... the theory is that we need to keep cutting the cash rate in order to boost inflation to hit the target.
Yeah. So if we are undershooting the target, which the Australian economy is, it's for the last 5 years undershot the 2 to 3% target. That means that we need to keep engaging in easier monetary policy in order to hit that. So I think that the easy monetary policy is a bad thing, and it's being encouraged by a target that we're not meeting. So in order to avoid employing harmful monetary policy, we need to get rid of the inflation target. I think Chris disagrees.
No, I want to hear Scott's view because I want to respond to that.
Yeah, well, I echo Kurt's position and merely point out that it did not come down with Moses from Mount Sinai. It was the
my history is completely wrong.
Yeah, sorry, Chris. It was contained originally in a joint statement from the then Treasurer Peter Costello and the incoming Governor of the Reserve Bank Ian Macfarlane in 1996.
To be honest, is as close to coming down from Moses as Australian politics gets, but sure.
Costello has made it very clear subsequently.
God was the first central banker.
That when they did this, they were talking about getting inflation down. There was no thought that this would ever become a floor on inflation. We had, a history of double-digit inflation. Economic theory was full of talk about expectations and how you actually break inflationary expectations. It was all about, and that's partly why they issued this statement. Oh, Here's one I prepared earlier.
Which you have in your physical hands?
Yeah, if you're listening to this on a podcast, by the way, not only am I holding up this piece of paper, you can see it on YouTube if you want to have a look.
Props work brilliantly on podcast. Well done, Scott.
Thank you. And where was I? Anyway, Costello said there's no way that he was thinking of this being a flaw. So it is time for Josh Frydenberg and the current governor to say jointly in an updated statement that we are dispensing with this 2 to 3% target and formulating it in some other way that's much more realistic.
All right, here's my concern. So I don't disagree with anything you've said. Obviously, there's nothing natural about a 2 to 3% inflation target. But the reason that we have targets is so that the RBA has to consistently hit them. And if we decide that the 2 to 3% target is now, the next treasurer can change it to a 1% target, then we don't have targets. Now, that will be catastrophic for the stability of the economy and for the predictability of the economy. So I think it's really the same argument that we've been having with the union bill. We have to figure out why the economy is sluggish and work on that first.
But why not? Why have a target of 2 to 3%? Why not a target of 0? I know people argue deflation is equally bad.
I'm actually quite supportive. If the economy does not support inflation, we should have a monetary policy of deflation. But if we have a holus bolus complete rethink of how we arrange monetary policy in Australia, then I'm all for resetting it to 0 or 30 or whatever it is that we decide. Not 30, hopefully. But whatever it is that we decide. But the idea that the Treasurer hears from the RBA that they have failed consistently to hit the thing that is supposed to be their rule, their sole purpose for existing in this system, and then go, that's fine, we'll just lower the target for you.
But the logic behind lowering the target isn't that because they've missed the target and therefore we're going to let them off and lower it. It's that by aiming for the 2 to 3% inflation, that's actually causing stupid monetary policy.
Yeah, but the monetary, but those two things are connected. It's stupid monetary policy. I agree with that, but it's stupid monetary policy caused by failures of productivity. It's caused by deep problems in the economy itself. And there's a school of thought in Canberra and in Sydney that we need to focus on the RBA, and the most important thing is the cash rate, when fundamentally the problem here is that we don't have the strong economy we want.
I think that raises a really, really good point, and I am no expert on monetary policy by any stretch, but what I will say as a macro political...
Do you own a house? That's the real question.
As a matter of fact, I do, but the point is that...
Just to get our biases out of the time. I wanted to go really low, to be clear.
This fixation on the RBA shows how depressingly dominant demand-side economics has become over the last 10 years, if that. There are very few people, if any, that are calling for supply-side reform to fix the economy and to get the economy moving. The remedies that are touted are almost always demand-side, whether it be quantitative easing and lowering interest rates and so on, paying public servants more as an idea that's floated, or these perennial calls for infrastructure. Now, I have nothing against, and we should all support, genuine productivity-enhancing infrastructure that can't be provided for by the private sector. That's fine. But building stuff we may very well not need as a means to stimulate the economy, by that logic, you may as well pay 500,000 people to dig a big hole, another 500,000 to fill it in again. But this is the level of sophistication of economic debate in Australia, and we are much poorer for it.
I couldn't agree more. And I was going to take this opportunity because we love listener feedback here, and we were contacted by Richard, who is a genuine and very successful businessman who was picking up on an earlier discussion about this, and like you made the point that we're actually focusing on the wrong things because we've got to get the focus back on a wealth creation, as he pointed out, and now there's lots of things which supposedly add value, but they're destroying wealth. And if I can get some indulgence from my co-host to read out,
as long as you say Long-time listener, first-time writer.
Long-term listener, first-time writer. Thank you, Richard. So he just said, amongst other things, he's drawing the contrast with America. He said, Trump is building industry that not only adds value but also creates wealth, whereas in Australia we are stopping agriculture, stopping new mines, not allowing development, and borrowing money to build football stadiums, tunnels, roads and train lines, none of which create wealth.
Right on.
Doesn't matter, commuting times don't matter if the job actually doesn't add productivity. That's a paraphrase. Trump is building wealth-creating industries and bringing some back on shore. Australia is destroying its industries that create wealth. These are simple ideas, but obviously need to be discussed because most Australians just do not understand.
Right on.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the fundamental problem that we have, and we have it on this podcast and we raise it all the time, but the media has it, shockingly, that we dance around the basic problem that the economy is not growing as it should be, as an economy with the education, natural resources, human capital should be able to grow, and it's not growing at that rate because we have stopped it from growing.
Correct.
But like we've made policy decisions to say no, we'd rather other things, and then we wonder why it's not growing.
It's a point to make. I think the economic reform agenda has basically stalled since John Howard was in the Lodge. I mean, how long ago was that?
Well, even the notion of an economic reform...
Is that a rhetorical question?
Yeah, but
not 12 years.
But maybe we even should jettison the notion of an economic reform agenda, because that sounds, with the greatest respect, because it sounds very wonky, and it brings to mind. I mean, Bill Shorten had an economic reform agenda. It would have driven the economy further into this regulatory morass, but it was presented as an economic reform agenda. What we're actually talking about is getting back to the fundamentals of how is wealth created.
Sure, but I think that's just because economics has been firstly co-opted and hijacked by the left, and secondly bastardised. You can see that in the fact that we are talking about tax cuts as handouts and tax increases as savings. I mean, the left have been very good at contorting economics to suit basically their social agenda.
I think the other issue, and this comes back to what Richard brought up, is just the way we measure economic success as well. We're just trying to manipulate all these aggregate statistics, like the price level, which is an arbitrarily determined measure of what counts as in this basket of goods, and we're going to measure if the price of that goes up or down. And then GDP, which is hugely driven by monetary policy, which doesn't necessarily result in actual improvements in material well-being, and driven by government spending, which we're just calling all government spending and private sector that actually adds value for people, and we're just equating that with government spending, wasteful government spending on pink bats and things like that, and saying it's all the same thing, and then saying, okay, the economy grew by 1% or something. Like, that doesn't actually tell you about anything real.
Yeah, the map is not the territory. These aggregate statistics were only created off the back of Keynesian economics.
Pardon my ignorance, but are there any indexes that exclude government spending and government wealth creation?
No, you can subtract that out of various indexes.
Yeah.
But look, the point is that the map is not the territory, but you do need the map. So we need a collection of these sorts of measures, and we need to read them with intelligence.
But the problem is what's happening even with like the inflation target is there's nothing that this whole thing about this 2 to 3 bracket didn't come down from
Moses'
Mount Sinai.
inflation target. Yep.
It's in fact from Mount Sinai we had like sound money.
Very good.
Not inflationist central banking. But the thing is that there's nothing that it says that inflation is consistent with sound economic growth. You can have inflation that is bad. You have like the stagflation of high unemployment and high inflation. With a stable money system, if you have goods in the economy growing at a faster rate than the money supply, you actually have deflation. So a lot of this is actually driven by a fear of deflation, which is based on our monetary system, which is, I think, inconsistent with economic growth. And I think that changes the focus of the economic debate towards these aggregate statistics and trying to insert monetary policy to fix these aggregates instead of looking at fundamental things about how wealth is created.
That's right. I mean, what it is basically the planner's fallacy. So we've decided that we govern the economy's money, so therefore we've got to figure out ways like how would we know whether to print more money or to not? And so we have to pick on these aggregate statistics, because how else would we do it? Unless you had a market-based system, which obviously Kurt is talking about, which is a sound money system or a free banking system or some variation, or, a crypto economy, just raising it. Blockchain?
Heaven forbid. We might leave that there, and I think there's much to build on next year. And I also think of yes, no one complains when the price of their flat screen television goes down, even while just about everything that's regulated, the cost of it goes up.
Yep.
That's right. We'll leave that there. It is time for our books and culture segment, where we share what we've been reading, watching, and listening to. Who would like to start us off?
Well, I'll start, because I usually volunteer.
Thank you.
And I wouldn't want to break that.
So it's when I say who would like to start us off, it's
because you look immediately at me. So
yeah,
so I am reading. I haven't finished, embarrassingly, for this podcast, a book called Music: A Subversive History by Ted Gioia. He is a music critic. And jazz musician, in fact, and I came across this book because I was listening to the Conversations with Tyler Cowen podcast, and he had him on, and I thought that sounded fantastic. There's a lot to this book. It's obviously, as the subtitle says, it's a history of subversive music, or the importance of subversion in music, in popular culture. But what I've drawn out of it is there's really two sorts of music. In culture and even in politics. There's sort of the official music, and the official music, as he describes it, historically tends to be quite formal. It can often be quite military. It can be strictly regulated from a musical sense, in that it's very mathematical. The chords and the scales are very rigidly defined, and it can be often very propagandistic. So it often will tell a story about great men, great leaders, great states, that sort of thing. And he contrasts this is his argument, and he contrasts this with what he describes as sort of popular music or subversive music, which can has totally different connotations. So historically, it's had connotations of magic. It's had connotations of sort of trance-like states when you listen to it. It's sexual, it's violent, and it's non-official religion. And the way this sounds a bit high concept, to be honest, and I think if I'd heard me describe it, I'd be like, are you sure? But it's actually quite convincing when you read it, and it drew out for me the relationship, an unexpected relationship, between state authority and oppositional subversive musical systems. Not in a 1960s Bob Dylan sense, but in a sometimes music is so fundamental to our culture that music that challenging music or popular music can undermine state hierarchy. And I'll give a quote, because he actually draws this all the way back to Plato. So if you know much about Plato, you know that Plato was opposed to music, but that's not quite it. Plato was opposed to some sort of music. So I'm going to quote the book here. In Plato, he writes, we repeatedly encounter two different types of music. One music is essential to a well-ordered society, according to Plato, but the other is risky and must be dealt with cautiously or even prohibited. Plato would have understood well the concept of subversive music. He constantly warns against it, quoting from Plato, beware of changing to a new form of music since it threatens the whole system. So there, and what I'm taking out of this book is an incredible relationship between power, anti-authoritarianism through music.
That makes sense, because I think every new wave of music has created a moral panic, whether it be jazz, the devil's music or whatever in the 20s when it emerged, whether it be, fast forwarding to the Tipper Gore-inspired hysteria over rap music. But I think that it can be broadened. I think all art can probably be boxed into, official and subversive. I mean, look at poetry. The great schism that was caused when poetry moved away from, sonnets and other very structured ways of writing to free verse and everything else. Whole books, whole novels have been banned for obscenity. The ones that we now consider classics, like Catcher in the Rye, Tropic of Cancer, and so on. So I think it's a fine thesis, but I suppose it can be broadened out to
it can, and so that process. Jazz obviously was very viewed as subversive, but of course jazz is now like the most bourgeois style music, and
it's structured too.
And so one of the examples that he uses, which is really powerful, is NWA, the rap group NWA, when NWA released its albums in the 1980s and 1990s, they were investigated by the FBI. There was an active FBI investigation. Now NWA is in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So there's obviously in modern states like to take the subversion and sort of tame it and own it. But what he's talking about...
What do you mean by modern states, though?
So 20th century states, I think, or 20th century developed economies.
In what sense does the state, the economy and the society, but the state isn't doing this?
I'm embarrassed. I've only read half the book.
Oh, right, okay.
So I don't
He will explain that.
I guess there is a state element because the state does fund a lot of art forms that previously wouldn't have. There's a reason why ABC Jazz is now probably broadcasting station. No, seriously.
To dwell slightly
you finally
on it.
actually come up with a reason why there is an ABC Jazz station.
I don't.
I'm always
give the
wondered.
ABC call because they're also looking for a reason for that.
There is a very, very important reason because I personally enjoy listening to it and I've paid for it, so I may as well enjoy it.
If only there was jazz music on the
internet.
internet.
We should privatise the ABC except for ABC Jazz.
But I just to slightly extend that point. So in the first half of the book, which I've read, he makes the point that music was, until very recently, a communal activity. And it's a communal activity that would involve beats and drums and chanting and all that sort of thing. And early states and early centres of power saw that communal organisation as a threat to its state power. It tried to co-opt it with military music and the drum beats that involved. But it did see the coordination of free people coming together freely to make music as an interesting threat to its power.
But surely, like the process where the subversive music becomes more mainstream, that's not driven necessarily by states. And I'm not sure. I've read Goya's his history of jazz.
Oh, okay, cool.
Haven't read this, but
You're a jazz man, Kurt.
Yes, I am.
I never knew that.
I think that. No, but like if you have categories of subversive music, how does it then become like mainstream if none of those things are changing? If you look at, I think an interesting example is from jazz history is the bebop rising in the 1940s. And I think is the main thing why it seems subversive is because people didn't understand it. But then, they thought it was chaotic. But actually, it's extremely mathematical, extremely a lot of structure. You could argue that it's got higher structures than the swing music that preceded it. But I'm not sure about how that works in that thesis.
Neither Chris, because he's only read half of it.
And it'll be my culture pick next week.
Stay tuned for part 2.
Gioia actually really hates the mathematical side, and that's that's what he dislikes about modern music. That's what he dislikes about the auto-tune. It takes the bending of notes that is part of that trance-like state. And anyway, that's the music segment for today.
Champion.
Ironic because trance music is entirely electronic, so...
Look, full of ironies.
Kurt,
so
you've been reading something even more serious.
Yeah, so my book is a new book from Lou Rockwell, who writes at lewrockwell.com, and he's also the founder and chairman of the Mises Institute. This book is called Against the Left, a Rothbardian Libertarianism. It's a short book. He draws a lot from Rothbard and Mises, as Rockwell tends to do. And so the main chapters he talks about the family, civil rights, immigration, environmentalism, and egalitarianism as the main organising thing behind a lot of the things of the left. And I think for me, it's a short book, but I think one of the interesting discussions is about the institution of the family and how egalitarianism, when consistently applied, really attacks that. And he brings up a debate between Robert Nesbitt and John Rawls, both 20th century philosophers, on this issue where Nesbitt challenges Rawls. How is the family consistent with a commitment to a radical egalitarianism? And Rawls' response is that basically it is inconsistent with egalitarianism, and he sort of hedges, saying that it's not. Well, because the family, the institution of the family is a major driver of inequality in opportunity. So, your parents play a huge role in creating an inequality of opportunity. So, this is a huge engine. It's at the centre of reality that people are unequal. Both innate and
what a perverse
conditioning.
But a big thing historically about the family and the state is that the family was the private community that the state could never figure out how to penetrate.
Well, your mate Plato, he wanted to get
my
rid of it.
mate Plato.
Children would be raised in common.
And
here
so,
we are, we're still talking about it.
So again, rich in ironies. But the family is a breaking down family structure was a way that the state could then see into that small community. Because think about what a family is. Not just a set of relationships. They live together. They have hopefully they have a house. And getting in the house from the state's perspective is the way to control the population.
You're talking about a different phenomenon though, Chris. You're talking about the family as a competing source of power vis-a-vis the state, whereas you're talking about something completely perverse, which is because good parenting can give children an advantage in life and therefore shoot them up the economic ladder, we should just abolish parenting because
or at least disincentivise good parenting.
Can we get? Sorry, Kurt. Can we go back to Nesbitt versus Rawls? So who won? Who won that smackdown?
Well, I think Nesbitt is correct.
Science advances funeral by funeral. Scott, as you know.
And Nesbitt actually, as Rockwell quotes him, talks about this line from Plato through to like Rousseau and that left wing view of egalitarianism versus an anti-family view versus a view through Aristotle going through to Burke and Tocqueville, and saying that Rawls is very much, if you actually consistently apply Rawls' philosophy, it is anti-family, and Rawls himself even acknowledges this. And I think it is for that reason that parents create unequal opportunity, but it is also for the reason that it is a rival power structure to the state, and you treating families within families, you treat family members differently to other people in society, and that's unequal. That involves discrimination, which is another part of Rockwell's book. The other and the interesting thing I think he brings up is that for the state, egalitarianism and environmentalism, as we touched on before, is a great instrument for the state to have these unachievable goals that just gives more and more power to the state, gives more justification for the state to intervene and increase its power.
Environmentalism, like the 2 to 3% inflation rate, is a target, not a goal.
Yeah, so I think that's an interesting point. And the other thing that he talks about is being against left libertarianism. So this idea that libertarians should also have a commitment to egalitarianism, to all these extra things beyond the use of violence in society. And I think that's an interesting point that he raises, is that the error of how classical liberalism degenerated into modern liberalism was basically because of this embracement, this expansion of what liberalism is, to embrace a lot of these left-wing ideas of equality.
No, and I think
like saying you're a small L liberal and that means we should support a carbon tax.
Yeah, well, I think that's a long way down the road of degradation.
No, it sounds like a very useful, and this is meant to be like an introductory or sort of general education primer almost.
Yeah, it's a short book. It's very readable, and it's fairly introductory, so it doesn't assume a lot.
Then we shall recommend it. I'm going to talk about a book that's not very short, actually, which is the remarkable Clive James, who, of course, died only very recently. The great man did an amazing range of things on television. He wrote something for the IPA in Climate Change, The Facts 2017, a terrific essay called Mass Death Dies Hard, and we've talked about that and paid tribute to that. I also wanted just to talk today about a book he wrote called Cultural Amnesia, Notes in the Margin of My Time, which is a series of essays. It's nearly 900 pages, but on various writers and thinkers that he came across. And I think this says a lot about Clive James and the breadth of his reading. It's actually arranged because he couldn't think of any other way to do it in alphabetical order. So if you look at K, he's got Kafka, Keats, Kolakowski, who is the historian of communism, Alexandra Kollontai, never heard of. Hida Margolius Cavalli, sounds Hungarian but never heard of. Karl Kraus, who I think was a Viennese satirist. And so one of the things that, just so grateful for everything Clive James contributed to culture, but what I love is here's a suburban boy, manages to find his way to university and then to Cambridge later. And it's like, why can't this kid from Kogarah be someone who reads all of this? Why can't he immerse himself in, the glories of, Viennese culture, before and after World War One? He takes it very, very seriously. As we all know, he's a brilliant writer. He's very interested in that point of engagement where writers meet culture, meet politics, meet society. So I couldn't possibly summarise what he's doing here, but you do enjoy reading the various sections because it's so well written. But I think it's the ambition of it as much as anything. And if one thing does come through, it is that tremendous sadness for the Middle European culture of which sort of went into the concentration camps in the 1930s thanks to the Nazis.
The loss of Vienna, basically.
Which we'll never get back, and people see echoes of it now. Stefan Zweig is having a bit of a renaissance because people are saying, what did it feel like to watch your culture disintegrating around you? I hope those parallels aren't correct. So Vale Clive James, just one of many terrific books that he wrote, and it is, of course, a series of 5-page essays, so a good one to dip in and out of.
It is an extraordinary book, and I remember consuming it avidly when it was first released, and it makes you want to buy more books, which is, of course, catastrophic, but doesn't help. But one of the frustrations is that the books that he wants you to read, very few of them have been translated into English. Yes. It's like, you should definitely read this German book and this French book, and you're like, yeah, I definitely should.
Yes, he taught himself to read in many languages.
And it kills you, and you feel very jealous, and I'm very impressed.
Yep, some of us have jobs.
So, you may, regular listeners of this podcast...
Sorry, that was just a little picture of Scott's internal life.
Yes,
as well.
Too many books, not enough time.
It's the story of all our lives, I think, especially in this line of work. I read... regular viewers and listeners of this podcast may remember that Evan Mulholland's pick earlier in the year was a show called The Loudest Voice, which was a show by... not sure who produced it, but it was on Stan, about Roger Ailes, who was the first CEO and builder of Fox News, who revolutionised the news landscape in the US. So I tuned in and I enjoyed that series so much I decided to read his book, which is You Are the Message, Getting What You Want by Being Who You Are. And... it's a book
in the genre of right-wing self-help books.
Yeah, right-wing self-help books. Well, if anybody needs
the Art of the Deal and You Are the Message,
if anybody needs help, it's me. What it is it's a book about his communications philosophy, basically. And look, the frustrating thing about it is that it's aimed at chiefly, business executives who need to give speeches or go and address the media about when their company's in hot water, or speak to AGMs of investors and so on. The good of it is, though, it really encapsulates his communications philosophy, and it gives a great insight into what he achieved at Fox News and the mentality he took with him. And one of the first things he says is that television changed the rules, not just on TV and on communications of news, but for all of us. Now that we are used to television, we're expecting brevity, we are expecting exciting presentation, and... his message is, look, a lot of speaking coaches will say, do this, do that, speak slowly, blah, blah, blah. He said, look, forget all that. What you really need to do is be the you at your very best. You need to take what your shtick is, whatever that is, and perform it in such a way that it has maximum effect. Performing, not acting. And you can see that coming through in, again, rewatching the series The Loudest Voice, in the way he developed his talent. I mean, it tells a story about the way he plucked somebody like a Sean Hannity out of obscurity, somebody who was working in talkback radio in Atlanta and 2 years before that had been a bricklayer or something, and turned him into a star by encouraging him to be the best. It sounds so trite and so hokey, but the best Sean Hannity he could be, and that was his strategy. So it was a very interesting read. I read it partly in the context of doing presentation work and TV work and projects we're working on in the studio. So it would have been better if it was aimed more at that. But for anybody who has to speak, and rather than the old picturing people in their underwear, this is a very good thing to read.
So what has it made you want to change? What? So is it performance style?
Just to be the best
style?
Gideon I can be.
Just the best Gideon.
Chris.
So you were going to be even more Gideon than you have been up to this point.
Yes, the full Rosner. No, look,
funny hats. I mean, Peter Fitzsimmons has the
peacocking
bandana,
and things like
so
that. Iconic. Look, I can't think of anything that I personally took away from it in terms of my style, but it is a very, very interesting insight into anybody who is interested in the media landscape in the US in Fox News, or just wants to brush up on their speaking when they have to give a toast at a wedding or something. I recommend.
And it does drive authenticity. I mean, you owe that to the audience to be who you are, even if it's a version of yourself.
Correct.
It's actually about engaging. Another great book there. In fact, we're going to have a special on books next week, Chris.
We are, Scott. So we're trying something out. So we haven't. This podcast has not been going a year. It's nearly a year, but so this is our first Christmas, and we're going to do a special holiday episode. We're going to speak to a number of IPA staff and friends about the books that they recommend for holiday reading, which I'm very much looking forward to, Scott.
Yeah, so that'll give you your reading, because there is too many books, not enough time. But summer's coming up.
It's just to make you feel bad.
Yeah,
that's really
right. Tell you what to buy, take away to the beach house or the caravan park or wherever.
And fail to get around to reading.
There's a Japanese word for that, isn't there? There's a Japanese word for the affliction of purchasing way more books than you have time to read.
Really?
Affliction, would we call it an affliction?
Absolutely it is. I think there's a room full of unread
lifestyle.
books.
And then Marie Kondo comes along and...
A room full of unread books, you don't think of it as your book collection, you think of it as your library. That way you never need to read the books, but they're there for reference.
Right, okay. Oh, good to know. It's a life hack.
Very good. Thank you, gentlemen. Don't forget, Looking Forward is a production of the Institute of Public Affairs. If you're not already a member, please do go to ipa.org.au and join right now. If you're listening to a podcast, please subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, subscribe so you don't miss any further episodes. I'd like to say a big thank you to our panellists today, Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Kurt Wallace.
Thank you.
And Gideon Rosner.
Always a pleasure.
And, of course, Josh Stranger and his crew in the studio. And we'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.